Hi, everyone. We're going to give it another minute or so, and then we'll get started. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Cleveland Ozone Non-Attainment Area, Reclassification to Serious Non-Attainment. I'm Kelly Hand, and I'll be moderating the event today. And I'd like to go over a few items before we begin our presentation. To minimize background noise, we have muted all attendees. However, we encourage your questions and comments throughout the presentation using the chat box located on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you have any technical assistance that you need, you can put your comment or question there as well. I'd like to introduce our speaker, Mike Rectanus. Mike is the principal consultant at BSI with more than 25 years of experience providing air compliance support to a variety of industrial clients and preparing complex air permit applications. So now I turn it over to Mike.
Thank you, Kelly, and welcome everyone. Appreciate you joining the webinar. I have a lot of information to present. I'd like to save at least 5 to 10 minutes at the end for questions. So we're going to get started here. So the goal of the webinar is to provide an overview of the 2015 Ozone Standard and non-attainment designations, and then discuss potential impacts to companies in the Cleveland area resulting from the reclassification of the area to serious non-attainment. The presentation is a bit more technical. If you've listened to any presented by Ohio EPA, I'm trying to cover a little bit more on the rules and the impacts. But it is, it's about definitions and it's fairly technical. So please ask questions using the chat function, and Kelly will either try to answer in the chat or we can save it till the end of the presentation. So to start out, I wanted to provide a quick background on ozone. As most of you know, ground level ozone is not emitted directly into the air, but is formed by the chemical reaction between oxides of nitrogen, NOx, and volatile organic compounds, VOCs, in the presence of sunlight. So ozone is one of 6 common air pollutants identified in the Clean Air Act, known as criteria air pollutants. The Clean Air Act requires EPA to set National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or NAQS, for these criteria air pollutants, which have been determined to be harmful to public health and the environment at elevated concentrations. So the Clean Air Act requires EPA to periodically review the standards to ensure that they provide adequate health and environmental protection and update those standards as necessary. So this slide provides a table summarizing the ozone standard since the first standard was issued in 1971. The main points I want to make from this table are that the ozone NAQS was originally established as a 1-hour standard. Then in 1997, EPA established an 8-hour standard, and the form of the standard is the 3-year average of the annual 4th highest daily maximum 8-hour average concentration. It's a mouthful. And then in 2005, EPA revoked the 1-hour standard, so it's just the 8-hour standard now. And then the 8-hour standard was lowered in 2008 to 75 parts per billion, and then finally again in 2015 to 70 parts per billion. So it's this 2015 standard is what is causing the Cleveland area to be classified as serious non-attainment. So how is the area attainment status determined? Again, this is a 3-year average of the annual 4th highest daily maximum 8-hour average concentration. This is called the design value. The design value is determined from ambient monitoring stations in the area and is compared to the standard. So if any station exceeds the standard in that area, the area is then designated as non-attainment. So as required by the Clean Air Act, Ohio EPA has established an ambient monitoring network across the state, and that currently includes 48 ozone monitors statewide. And then for purposes of defining the design value for ozone, the monitoring is conducted during the ozone season, which is March 1st through October 31st. So in the Cleveland area, the Ohio EPA is operating 11 monitors. These sites include 9 in the Cleveland-Elyria Metropolitan Statistical Area and 2 in the Akron MSA. So how do we get to serious non-attainment? For the initial non-attainment designations and for the 2015 standard, US EPA designated 52 areas across the country as non-attainment, and that included Columbus, Cincinnati, and Cleveland areas. These were all originally designated as marginal non-attainment. The marginal attainment date was August 3rd, 2021. So based on monitoring from 2016 through 2018, Ohio EPA was able to demonstrate that the Columbus area was able to attain the standard, and the area was officially redesignated as attainment in August of 2019. However, the Cincinnati and Cleveland areas did not meet the ozone standard by the marginal attainment date, so they were reclassified as moderate non-attainment in 22. Later that year, based on the more recent monitoring data, the Cincinnati non-attainment area was reclassified as attainment. So specifically for Cleveland, it was in August 3rd, 2018, it was designated as a marginal non-attainment area. And then based on monitoring data from 2018 to 2020, the Cleveland area did not attain the standard by the August 3rd, 2021 deadline. Therefore, in October of 22, the Cleveland area was officially reclassified as marginal, from marginal to moderate non-attainment, and was required to meet the standard by August 3rd, 2024. So based on monitoring data collected from 21 through 23, the Cleveland non-attainment area failed to meet the 2015 standard and was reclassified as serious non-attainment effective last Thursday. So the serious area non-attainment date is now August 3rd, 2027. So that's the next step in the process. So this slide, I just wanted to provide a table of the design values for each of the 11 ozone monitors in the Cleveland area. And as you can see, there's 2 stations with design values that exceeded the 2015 standard of 70 parts per billion. The other thing to note here is that there was somewhat of an increase for most of these stations between 22 and 23 compared to 21. So it'll be interesting to see what the 24 data looks like. There's a good possibility that there could be additional monitors that have design values that exceed the standard, or are at least getting pretty close. And then the figure on the right, it shows the design values for the Cleveland area. So this is, whatever the maximum of the 11 stations for the design value. So this shows a trend over the last 15 years. And as you can see, the design value over the past 5 years or so has bounced between 72 and 74 parts per billion, which is, just above the 70 ppb standard. This slide, it just shows the location of the 2 monitors that are exceeding the standard. One's in Lake County and one's in Cuyahoga County. So with this chart, I kind of borrowed this from an Ohio EPA presentation that was done last year. I wanted to just give kind of a brief summary of the NOx and VOC emissions within the Cleveland non-attainment area. This is based on the 2020 emission inventory. So as you can see, for NOx point sources, those from industrial facilities, coming from stacks, only make up about 10% of the NOx emissions within the non-attainment area. The on-road and non-road make up about 65%, with the non-point sources being 25%. Similarly with the VOC, about 5% of the VOC emissions are coming from point sources. So it'll just be interesting to see what measures Ohio EPA puts in place to be able to attain the standard, since the point sources are a relatively insignificant portion. Unfortunately, the regulations are what they are, and you're still going to have to comply with them, even though you may not be the driving factor to meet attainment. So now I want to move to discussing potential impacts to companies within the Cleveland nonattainment area based on the current regulations as well as the proposed revisions to those regulations. On January 6th, the Ohio EPA made available a draft of amended rules required under the Clean Air Act due to the reclassification to serious nonattainment, and a draft of the State Implementation Plan, or SIP, for a reasonable available control technology, RACT, that's required under the serious nonattainment classification. So the amended rules are included, Chapter 23 for Preconstruction Permitting, Chapter 21 for the VOC RACT rules, and Chapter 110 for the NOx RACT requirements. Generally speaking, the regulatory impacts resulting from the reclassification from moderate to serious will be the greatest for those sources that have NOx and VOC emissions between 50 and 100 tons per year. So those are now new major sources of NOx and VOC. So I'll cover that a little bit more detail, but so I also wanted to provide a high-level review of the draft rule amendments. So I'll get to those in a minute. But to start out, I wanted to kind of just give a brief overview of what I consider the impacts on existing major sources. So those are the sources that have potential to emit of NOx or VOC over 100 tons per year. So most importantly, the significant emission rate threshold is being reduced from 40 to 25 tons per year. I'll discuss this in a little more detail when we talk about the definition of major modification. And also, if you have to go through nonattainment new source review, it now includes a minimum offset ratio of 1.2 to 1 for serious nonattainment areas. That's up from 1.15 to 1 ratio for the moderate area. The NOx RAC exemption is also being reduced from 25 tons per year to 10 tons per year. So that can now make units that were previously exempt from the NOx RAC study requirements to have to be included in a NOx RAC study. Those would be the emission units that had between 10 and 25 tons per year that are not covered under a different RACT. For the VOC RAC exemption threshold, it's being reduced from 100 to 50 tons per year of VOC emissions from sources that are not covered under regulation for CTG RAC sources, which I'll cover in a minute. Just wanted to note also for existing major sources that if you submitted an updated RAC study prior to March 2023 associated with the moderate RAC SIP call, you will not need to resubmit another RAC update under the serious RAC SIP. However, you will need to complete a RAC study for any sources that were previously exempt that no longer meet the revised exemption thresholds. So moving on to what I'm calling the new major sources, those are the ones with NOx or VOC emissions between 50 and 100 tons per year. So they're going to be subject to all the same requirements that I just mentioned for existing major sources. So one thing is, if you don't already have a Title V permit as a result of other pollutants, you will need to apply for a Title V permit. So if you're not a Title V source, as of last Thursday, you are now a major source and you need to submit a Title V permit, and that is due before January 16th of 2026. In lieu of applying for a Title V permit, a federally enforceable permit to install and operate, or FEPDO, may be obtained prior to January 16th, 2026. That includes the federally enforceable requirements to reduce the facility-wide emissions between or below 50 tons per year. So again, that permit needs to be issued before January 16th of 2026, or you would be out of compliance for the Title V requirement to obtain or to submit a Title V application within 1 year becoming subject to the rule. Additionally, NOx RAC study will be required for all NOx sources at the facility, other than the boilers, gas turbines, and internal combustion engines. with potential emissions greater than 10 ton per year. I'll provide a little bit more information on that in a second. For minor sources, so those with NOx or VOC emissions less than or equal to 50 tons per year, there's really no immediate impact to the facility unless you are planning a project that could increase your emissions to 50 tons per year or more. And then in that case, you would become a major source and all the requirements I just described would apply. So to provide a little bit more information on the impacts of operating in the serious non-attainment area, I wanted to review some of the regulatory changes that are driving the impacts I just mentioned. So for existing major sources, probably the most significant rule revision is the definition of major modification. So Ohio EPA is now proposing to modification to, a revision to the definition of major modification in 3745-3101. They're adding a subsection G for serious non-attainment. And the language in that is consistent with Section 182 of the Clean Air Act. But the first part of this definition is related to the major modification threshold. So it's a little bit different on how it is defined now compared to how it used to be with the two-step process under PSD and marginal minor non-attainment. So the new section GI in the changed rule states for serious non-attainment areas, a project is not a major modification if the net emission increase of NOx or VOC does not exceed 25 tons per year when aggregated with all other net emission increases from the source over any period of 5 consecutive calendar years. That includes the year in which such increase occurred. So again, the major source threshold is reduced from 40 to 25 tons per year, but the accounting is based on aggregated with all other net emissions increases from the source over the period of 5 years. So the new definition also allows some flexibility for sources to comply with the increased level of control required under the non-attainment new source review. And so the first is another section's added to allow some flexibility for sources with potential emissions less than 100 tons per year. These are sources that were not previously subject to non-attainment new source review. The new provision provides two options for flexibility. Option one, the project will not be considered a major modification if the source elects to offset at an internal offset ratio of 1.3 to 1. So after you do your netting analysis and you determine your project emissions and those in the previous 5 years, if you can then have offsets from other emission units at your facility at a ratio of 1.3 to 1, then you're not considered a major modification and you wouldn't be subject to non-attainment new source review. Option two, if the source does not elect to offset with internal offsets, the project is considered a major modification and traditional offsetting requirements apply, but RACT applies instead of LAIR. So this is, again, for those sources that are between 50 and 100 tons per year, LAIR would not apply, RACT would. So that's the flexibility that's provided in this revised rule. For existing major sources, there's a section added to allow some flexibility. So for those sources that have the potential to emit 100 tons per year or more, for these sources, a contemporaneous net emissions increase above the significance level is considered a major modification, so above 25 tons per year. However, if the source elects to offset at an internal offset ratio of 1.3 to 1, LAIR does not apply. So those are some of the changes to the definition of major modification. The definition of major source is also being revised. The definition is revised to add a new section that defines the major source threshold as 50 tons per year of NOx in any serious non-attainment. They didn't have to add that for VOC, it was already in the rule, but because the NOx threshold for serious non-attainment was not included, they've now added that to the definition. They're also revising the definition of significant to be consistent with the definition of major modification by adding 25 tons per year of VOC or NOx for serious or severe ozone non-attainment areas in the significant emission rate table of the definition. There's some few other changes, and they're not in chapter 3121, the non-attainment provisions. They've just added some language for clarification that adds VOCs and NOx as the air pollutants covered. They also added a little bit of definition on anti-backsliding, that the provisions of 40 CFR 51-1105 would apply. So these are some of the changes that are in the definitions section of 3101. So I wanted to also talk about changes related to the VOC RACT rules. So with this slide, I just wanted to give a high-level summary of the VOC RACT requirements as they currently are before we discuss the changes. So the VOC RACT regulations in Chapter 21 of 3745, the major portions of the RACT requirements cover approximately 40 source categories based on US EPA's control technique guidelines, and 5 source categories that are based on non-CTG. So the emission limits defined for these source categories have been applicable to sources in the Cleveland non-attainment area for some time now, and these emission limits and the requirements are not revised, so there are no changes that should impact existing sources. The rule also has provisions for other non-CTG based sources with potential VOC emissions of 100 tons per year or more that would require a RACT study to determine if controls are technically and economically feasible. So looking at the changes to the rules that Ohio EPA has proposed, there's only a couple important changes in the rules. Most of the changes are for clarification or for consistency. For example, Ohio EPA is adding a definition for source-specific RACT in the definitions of Chapter 21 to avoid unnecessary duplication of the criteria in several reference sections. So you'll see if you look at the red line strikeout of the rule, source-specific RACT is used now throughout Chapter 21, just for clarification. Another clarification change is in paragraph F of 2109, which is being revised to clarify the provisions of the section apply to film and foil in addition to paper. Ohio EPA is making this change just again for clarification. This change shouldn't impact any sources, as the CTG, the guidelines for the source category, has always applied to paper, film, and foil coating. So again, this is just a consistency clarification change. For the one of the significant changes in Chapter 21 is revising the applicability threshold from 100 to 50 tons per year for potential VOC emissions for sources that are not subject to the CTG or the categorical non-CTG RACT requirements. So again, this is to be consistent with the new definition of major source for serious non-attainment areas. So if you're not covered by, you're not one of the 40 source categories, or you're a non-CTG RACT source, you will need to conduct a RACT study if you have emissions between 50 and 100 tons per year. So that will now apply. Similarly, the applicability threshold for the 5 categorical non-CTG RACT sources are being revised to reduce the threshold from 100 tons per year to 50 tons per year. For these regulations is uncontrolled potential VOC emissions. So sources that are covered under any of these categorical non-CTG RACT sources with a total potential emissions between 50 and 100 tons per year will now be subject to these requirements. So this lists the 5 non-CTG RACT source rules. And if you need more information on this, Appendix F of the draft RACT SIP provides kind of the synopsis on the rule changes. So real quick, an overview of the NOx RACT requirements. Again, this slide is the summary of the existing rules. Most of you are aware, The NOx RACT rule includes presumptive NOx emission limits for 4 source categories based on the characteristics of the source, such as size, fuel type, and method of firing. Additionally, the NOx RACT rule applies to other sources of emission units at the facility with the potential NOx emissions of more than 100 tons per year. The rule also provides some exemptions from the requirements for the units for those that emit less than 25 tons per year NOx. However, that's changing with the rules that I'll talk about here in a second. So the applicability section of the NOx RACT rule in Chapter 110 is being revised to expand the requirements for NOx RACT to facilities with potential emissions between 50 and 100 tons per year, again, to be consistent with the major source definition. This revision will impact facilities that are now major sources, requiring them to complete a NOx RACT study on emission units other than the boilers, gas turbines, and IC engines that do not qualify for an exemption. Now, the exemption threshold in 110.03K for individual emission units are being lowered from 25 to 10 tons per year. So this revision will require facilities that previously submitted NOx RACT studies to update the study to include those emission units between 10 and 25 tons per year. So again, there's no changes to the presumptive NOx emission limits. So if you're subject to 2109, there really should not be any change. So that's everything I covered. I know I sped through it. I just wanted to make sure I captured everything. So I don't know if Kelly, if there was any questions that came up while I sped through that.
Do we have any questions? It's not too late to ask.
So I know I sped through all that. So just to summarize, if there's no other questions, the main points here. So for the sources that are now a major stationary source, those with between 50 and 100 tons per year of NOx or VOC, you do need to submit. You're now subject to Title V. So if you didn't have a Title V permit for other pollutants, you now need to submit an application for a Title V permit. So you'll go from a PTIO to a Title V source. If you're considering obtaining a federally enforceable PTIO, you will need to act soon to ensure the permit is issued before January 16th. So the difference again, if you're going to go FFDO, you need the permit in hand by January 16th. If you are going to submit a Title V application, you just need to have the application in prior to January 16th. And then, so for major sources, if you're considering a capital project, that would include an increase in NOx or VOC emissions above the 25 ton per year significant threshold. You need to begin, you're planning on that, and you need to start to determine what the appropriate level of control is. Complete a contemporaneous netting evaluation and ensure you have the offsets available. So whether, you can go with the internal offset, which will reduce some of the burden of the regulation, or you're going to need to go through the traditional offset analysis with external sources. Sources with NOx emissions greater than 50 tons per year, you should start to begin your NOx RACT study for any emission unit greater than 10 ton per year, excluding those that are in the presumptive NOx RACT category. So again, if you submitted a NOx RACT study for those sources, 25 tons per year and greater, you do not need to resubmit that, but you will have to look at those sources that you may have considered exempt between 10 and 25 tons per year. We do have some links. I don't know, Kelly, if you've been able to post those, but if you want to look at the revised rules, the public comment period for those proposed rules ends on February 13th. So if you have any comments, you'll need to provide those by February 13th. So that's pretty much the end of my presentation. If anybody has any questions, again, this is my email address. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. I've been reviewing a lot of the regs and a lot of the background information, so I hopefully could provide some additional information to you if you need it. I'd also like to just give a little plug here that we do have some upcoming webinars, and we are going to be presenting this year at the Ohio Safety Congress and Expo, and a few other here. So at these conferences, we'd love to meet you if we don't already know you. So with that, I've hit my 30 minutes.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you very much for joining.
Yes. Please, thank you everyone for attending, and watch out for our follow-up email within the next few days. That will include a link to today's recording. And again, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. And thank you again. Have a great day.